My name is Victor Cabral, and I'm the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Fluence Training. I flew to Iceland from the US for a conference on psychedelics as medicine. We need to ask the question, who's being left out of this conversation? One of my new missions at Fluence is to interview trailblazers in the psychedelic movement. I want to find out what it's going to take to make this medicine accessible to as many people as possible.
So we were able to introduce MDMA to rabbis, to monks.
Here in Iceland, I sat down with Rick Doblin, one of the leaders in psychedelic medicine.
So our new goal is a world of net zero trauma by 2070.
He's the founder of MAPS, or the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which is on the cusp of getting FDA approval of MDMA to treat PTSD. We're calling these conversations Emergent Pathways. Rick, thank you so much for making the time to sit down with me today. Can you tell us more about yourself and what inspired you to start MAPS?
So I'll start with what inspired me to focus my life on psychedelics. And so I was raised with, politically progressive parents, and they encouraged me to be involved in the struggles of the day. But as a young child, I was born in 1953, not long after World War II. And so I was taught stories of the Holocaust and stories of World War II from a Jewish family. And that just horrified me, that people could so dehumanize others to the point of massacring them and trying to wipe them off the face of the earth. And I just kept thinking, how could that be? How could people do that to each other? Slavery, how could people do that? And then when I was not that much older, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was like the whole world could blow up in smoke, and there could be a nuclear war between the US and Russia. And we were trained in school to duck and cover under the desks that maybe we could survive, and that was terrifying. So I grew up with this sense that humanity's technological developments had proceeded very much more in advance of our emotional and spiritual maturity, that we couldn't really handle the technology that we had. Our minds were brilliant, but our hearts and our souls were primitive. And I was always thinking it was the other. It was the Nazis, it was the Germans, it was the Russians. And then I was in one of the last years of the lottery for Vietnam. And then all of a sudden it's my own country doing things that I thought were imperialistic and supporting dictators. And it just was like, what am I going to do? So I decided, I studied nonviolent resistance. And I studied Thoreau and Martin Luther King and Tolstoy and Gandhi. And I developed this approach to what I would do with Vietnam. That I would be a draft resistor, and that I would go to jail, and that I would be an example of someone, that I would cost the system energy by doing that. But this whole time, I believed all the propaganda about psychedelics. I believed that if you took a psychedelic, it made you crazy. We were told that if you take LSD 5 or 6 times, you're certifiably insane, that that's all it took, and that it would hurt your chromosomes, and you'd have terrible children. And I didn't know any better. I'm the oldest of 4 children. My parents didn't even drink, and so I believed all that. I took Russian to learn about the other, and in my Russian class, a friend of mine gave me a book to read, and I loved it. And I handed it back to him, and he said, "Do you realize this person who wrote this book wrote part of it under the influence of LSD?" And I said, "That's impossible. LSD, nothing good can come from LSD." And he said, "No, check it out." It turned out it was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. And that's what really shattered my sense that what I had been taught might not be really true. And so I decided I would move forward and try psychedelics. So in my freshman year of college, I decided to try LSD. And the first experience was very difficult. I wasn't very emotional. I wasn't very open. I had a hard time losing my sense of self, but I had these intimations of being part of something much bigger, that from evolutionary history and from beyond my sense of who I was in my particular biography, that we're part of some enormous, incredible, magnificent adventure of life. And once I had that sense that I was part of something bigger, this was around the same time, this was now 1971, and it was right after we had gone to the moon. And so the astronauts were saying something very similar, that they would look back at the Earth and they would see it was one thing, and you wouldn't see the countries and the boundaries. And so the astronauts often were spiritualized. I felt that this experience of connecting to something deeper than ourselves, that could be the antidote to genocide, to racism, to prejudice. And so it was really political reasons that make me focus on psychedelics. Also, my parents knew that I was not going to register for the draft and I was going to go to prison instead. I thought that they would catch me and I would go to prison. And so my parents said, well, that's okay, but you have to realize that you're not going to ever have a normal job because you're going to be a felon. You can't be a doctor. My dad is a doctor. You can't be a doctor or a lawyer or anything that requires a license. So I thought, okay, I'll just have to pay that price. I'll figure out something else to do. So when I started doing psychedelics, I thought, aha, I can be an underground psychedelic therapist. You don't need a license for that. There are no licenses for that. So that was when I was 18 years old. And I read the work of Stan Grof and decided to drop out of college and work on myself, which took me 10 years, basically. So I went back to college to study how to become a psychedelic psychotherapist, and that was in 1982. Started, though, my first semester off campus. I went to New College of Florida, which was a private school when I started. Now, you may have heard that DeSantis is trying to squash New College. He's trying to make it into like a Christian fundamentalist school. So it's the honors college of the state of Florida. And so DeSantis has just appointed various people on the board of trustees to kill the spirit at New College. But I was there when it was private and then when it was public, but still supported this idealism. And so I was able to do off-campus study, and I went to Esalen in Big Sur, and I did a month-long workshop. And it was with Stan Grof, who I'd studied with before, and that's where I learned about MDMA. And so when I learned about MDMA, it was both a legal drug as used under the code name Adam as a therapy drug, but it was also starting to be sold as ecstasy in public settings. And so when I learned about it, I knew that this was it was doomed. This was during Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan and Just Say No and the escalation of the drug war again. So I started going to meetings at Esalen for this therapeutic community that people were trying to figure out how do we protect the therapeutic use of MDMA. So we had this advantage. We knew the DEA was coming after us, but they didn't know we existed. They just knew about ecstasy. So we were able to introduce MDMA to rabbis, to monks, to psychiatrists at Harvard Medical School, to build people who might become witnesses in a legal case against the DEA to try to keep MDMA legal as a therapy drug. And so I started a nonprofit in '84 before MAPS, and it was called Earth Metabolic Design Lab. It was connected to Buckminster Fuller, and that was what we used to organize the community of psychedelic therapists and researchers to try to protect MDMA. So we started winning in the court of public opinion. We had the rabbi compared MDMA to the Sabbath. The monk said a monk spends his whole life trying to reach the enlightened attitude you can get with MDMA. We had psychiatrists saying that this was tremendously valuable. And we started winning in the court as well. And we won the court case. The judge said that MDMA should be Schedule III. It should be illegal for recreational use, but legal for therapeutic use. But the administrator of the DEA rejected the recommendation and criminalized both therapeutic and recreational use of MDMA. So I realized at that time that the only way to bring back psychedelic medicine and bring back MDMA was to do work through the FDA, that was a difficult path, but that was the only open door. So that's why I started MAPS as a nonprofit psychedelic pharmaceutical company to try to move MDMA through the regulatory system to make it into a medicine. Now that was almost 37 years ago. I didn't know that it would take so long. But when I started, I didn't know that it would ever work. I just felt like this is the only way and I want to do it no matter what. And I think that's what's helped me not burn out, that I was able to realize that there was so much opposition that if I could define success only as making MDMA into a medicine, I might be discouraged along the way. But I define success as trying hard for a noble cause. And as long as I tried hard, I could be happy at the end of the day, whether it worked or not. And so that's the origin story for MAPS.
Amazing. Amazing. I think I've heard parts of that story, but I don't think I've ever heard it like this. So I know that there's MAPS, the nonprofit, and then there's MAPS PBC.
Yeah.
So could you clarify for us what they are, how they overlap, how they're related, etc.? Because I think for therapists, there's a confusion, and I think sometimes they get conflated.
Yes,
and
yes.
it would be good for them to understand what the two do. And
okay. So MAPS as the nonprofit was started in April 8th, 1986. And at the time, what I had assumed was that I knew that MDMA had been invented by Merck in 1912 and it was in the public domain. I knew that the therapeutic approach that we were going to use was similar to the therapeutic approach for LSD or psilocybin, and that was also in the public domain. I also knew that there had been published synthesis of MDMA, and that was also in the public domain. So I just assumed that once we made MDMA into a medicine, it would immediately become a generic drug, and that there was really, not much monetary opportunity there, but it was more for public benefit, and that was fine. Eventually, I realized that after I graduated college in 1987 with a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I wanted to get a clinical psych PhD to learn how to do psychotherapy outcome research to show that MDMA would be effective as an adjunct to psychotherapy, but nobody would let me in to graduate school. So I mentioned I would want to do MDMA research, and it was illegal, and so I couldn't get in. And so I was frustrated, and I had this sense of what am I going to do? What do I do next? And sometimes when I'm stuck, I smoke marijuana to get new ideas. And I realized that what was going on was that the science that I wanted to do was blocked by the politics, and that I wanted too much too soon, and I needed to pivot and study the politics. So that's where I went to the Kennedy School of Government to get my master's and PhD. And my PhD I got in actually 2001, and it was on the FDA regulation of the medical use of psychedelics. But I still assumed that MDMA would become a generic medicine. And it wasn't until 2014 that I learned that there was this obscure policy of the FDA that I had not learned about. I took a class in food and drug regulation at Harvard Law School by the America's leading pharmaceutical lawyer, Peter Barton Hutt. He didn't mention this. It wasn't mentioned in the class book. But that in 1984, Ronald Reagan had signed a law to develop incentives to develop drugs that were off patent. And those incentives are called data exclusivity. So they can't give patents, but it means that if you can make a drug into a medicine that's never been made before, you're permitted to have exclusive use of your data for 5 years. So generics can't come in. And then if you do pediatric studies, which we are being required to do, you get an extra 6 months of data exclusivity. And then it blocks the generics from having the FDA review their application until the 5.5 years is over, and it could take FDA a year or so to evaluate that. So that's when I realized that there was this opportunity for MAPS, if we do make MDMA into a medicine, to have a business out of it. And we've raised over $140 million in grants and donations, mostly donations to MAPS. But I realized that there's going to be, MDMA is for PTSD, but MDMA is good for so many other things, that if we continually went to donors to do charitable donations for more research, we might exhaust the donors. And I realized because of this data exclusivity that there was the possibility of creating a business. But we wanted to innovate, not just in psychedelic-assisted therapy, but in how pharmaceutical drugs are marketed. And right now they're marketed by for-profit companies. And they're profit maximizing. They're not for what's best for patients, they're what's best for the shareholders. And so I realized that if we could create the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, that would be our pharmaceutical arm, that would be our business arm. And so the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation was created in December 2014, and it's 100% owned by the nonprofit. And so the Public Benefit Corp now has about 160 people working for it. The nonprofit has about almost 40 people working for it. And the nonprofit appoints the board of directors of the Public Benefit Corporation. A few years ago, to my total surprise, I did not predict it, was the rise of for-profit psychedelic companies. We'd cleared out a lot of the regulatory obstacles. We'd shown that it is possible to get good results in a clinical setting. And so that inspired other people to try to do work with psilocybin, with other substances in a for-profit way. that made it difficult for us to continue to get the donations that we needed, because a lot of the donors were saying, well, if we can donate, but we could also invest in all these other companies. So we have started to take investors. We've got about $43 million in what's called a royalty share. So we will share royalties from the sale of MDMA by prescription if we do make it into a medicine. But the people who have the royalty share don't have any seat on the board of directors. They don't have any control. Now we're trying to take a loan of around $20 million. And so the Benefit Corp is designed to provide commercialization if MDMA does become a medicine, to provide for patient access, to sell MDMA at a profit, and then the profits would be used for the mission of the nonprofit, which would be more research, more public education, patient assistance, work on drug policy reform. But the existential issue for us now going forward is we need a large amount of money still to reach both getting MDMA approved by the FDA. Right now, we think that'll take place around May or so of 2024. And then once we start selling MDMA by prescription, it will be limited by the number of trained therapists. So we think that the sustainability point, where income from the sale of MDMA covers our expenses, will be at the end of 2025. So the challenge for us now is to try to find the resources that we need, ideally from donors, so MAPS retains sole control of the Benefit Corporation. But they are two different entities, they have two different board of directors, and the mission of the nonprofit is broader. It's mass mental health, a spiritualized humanity. It's to reform drug policy, to make fundamental human right to alter your consciousness, to make these substances available in a legal context for a low cost. And at the same time, the Public Benefit Corporation is designed to try to make MDMA into a medicine that would be sold at pharmaceutical prices, but would be covered by insurance. So that's how the two entities interact.
And I do have a follow-up question for you. So we know about, well, there's a recent legislation that was introduced called the Breakthrough Therapies Act, which would reschedule MDMA and potentially psilocybin if, and other drugs that are designated as breakthrough therapies. So if that change happens, would that then open up more funding for the work that MAPS is doing, or would it still be the same outlook in terms of?
I think if it happens, I mean, the FDA has already declared MDMA a breakthrough medicine. If that passes and we're able to start patient access, the key part is that the insurance coverage is not likely to happen until the FDA says yes. If we do this in a legislative way, the same way with medical marijuana, all the medical marijuana patients have to pay for their medicine themselves. There's no insurance coverage because it hasn't been through the FDA. So I think if it passes, it will help the climate. It will make it easier for FDA and DEA to say yes and to reschedule. But I don't think it'll affect the finances. I don't think it'll help us raise additional resources. We'll still have that challenge of can we find the amount that we need from philanthropists. And we're at this rare, unique situation where we have, we will be taking in somewhere like $60, $70 million, something like that, from investors, but it's without board seats, without control, so that we can still keep the public benefit mission first.
So there have been some recent developments with regard to the MAPS Phase 3 trial, and can you tell us more about what's happening?
Yeah. So in terms of Phase 3, to explain to people, Phase 3 is the final stage of research where you have to do randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blind studies to prove safety and efficacy. You don't have to prove how it works. The FDA doesn't really care how it works because a lot of times we don't even know how things work. The brain is super complex, but if it works, and if it works with an acceptable risk-benefit ratio, then it should be available to patients. So the Phase 1 studies are basic safety studies, usually in healthy volunteers, and we started Phase 1 in 1992, and that took us through the 90s. Phase 2 studies are pilot studies where you do small studies, and the goal of them really is to figure out how to design Phase 3, if you want to go to Phase 3. So phase 2 studies, you look at the dose, you look at who the patients are, who you include, who you exclude, how many treatment sessions, what population does it work with, who doesn't it work with. So from 2000 to 2016, we did the phase 2 studies. And so November 29th, 2016, we had the end of phase 2 meeting with FDA. 30 years after I started MAPS, we finally had the end of phase 2 meeting, and FDA said yes, we could go to phase 3. So in 2017, we spent about 8 months negotiating with the FDA in what's called special protocol assessment. And the goal is to get in a, quote, agreement letter where you agree with FDA on the design of the phase 3 and all the other information they want. And if you get this agreement letter, then FDA is legally bound to approve MDMA if the studies generate statistically significant evidence and there's no new safety problems arise and you've gathered the evidence in a rigorous way. So in 2018, we started the first phase 3 study, and you have to succeed in 2. Pharmaceutical companies are permitted to do as many phase 3 studies as they want. You can have 5 failed studies, but if you have 2 that succeed, then you'll be able to get approval, usually. So the first phase 3 study that we did was, each of these were going to be 100 subjects. And the first phase 3 study, we were almost at the end when COVID happened in 2020. And so we were shut down, and we negotiated with FDA that we would end the study with 90 people instead of 100. The study was tremendously successful. It was highly statistically significant. For those that know statistics, it was 0.0001, means a 1 in 10,000 chance that the results were random and not due to MDMA as added to therapy. And so we published the results. We had 32% of the people in the control group had therapy without MDMA. These are severe PTSD, people who have, some of them have attempted suicide in the past. We worked with the hardest cases, and 32% no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD after the therapy without any MDMA at all. But when we add MDMA to the therapy, 67% no longer had PTSD. And another 21% had what's called clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms. They still had PTSD, but their life was changed because their symptoms went down, and they might over time continue to go down. So we had 88% responders and 12% non-responders. So it's important to say it doesn't work for everybody. What was particularly satisfying for us is that this was published in Nature Medicine, May 10th, 2021. And at the end of the year, the journal Science, considered to be the premier scientific journal in the world, they have a survey of what are the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the year. And they designated our paper to be one of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs in the world. And I think it's because our paper was so great, but it was also because it's the leading edge of psychedelic-assisted therapy. What made that particularly satisfying is that 20 years before, the same journal Science had published this article that they never should have published that claimed that MDMA could hurt dopamine and could cause Parkinson's. This was a study in primates. They killed a bunch of the primates from overdoses during the drug. And we knew that the study didn't make sense. And we challenged it and challenged it. And for a year, the scientists kept defending the study, but they had been unable to replicate it. And what they finally realized is that they had mistakenly given methamphetamine instead of MDMA to these primates. And methamphetamine is stronger than MDMA. So they're giving the wrong drug in really high quantities and causing dopaminergic problems with these animals. And once that came to light, the Science really apologized. They withdrew the article. You know, when it was first published, the editor of Science said that taking MDMA is like playing Russian roulette with your brain. It was just so loaded, so politically loaded, that it was very disturbing to us. But for 20 years later, for Science to say our MDMA study was one of the top 10 breakthroughs in the world, it was more sweet to us that knew about how our relationship with science had been so terrible 20 years before. So the results of our first phase 3 study were extremely promising. And in fact, they were so good that they met the criteria for applying to the FDA to go forward with just 1 phase 3 study instead of 2. To do that, you need 0.001, meaning 1 in 1,000 chance that it's due to random factors, and we had 1 in 10,000. We had an excellent safety record. But the FDA said no. They said, we want you to complete the second phase 3 study. We were already in process with the second phase 3 study, so we decided that we would just continue with that. And so just last week, we put out a press release about the results of our second phase 3 study. And the results were similar to the first. It was very, very successful and an excellent safety track record. And so now we are going to be gathering all of our information to submit to the FDA, probably by July or so of 2023, I mean. And then we think FDA may give approval around April or May of 2024. So the second results, we can't really reveal all of the details now because we want to make sure that it gets into a scientific journal. But what I can tell you is that the way you have to get 2.05 studies, and that's 1 in 0.05 is like a nickel out of a dollar, 1 in 20 chance that it's random. And if you have to have 2 of it, you multiply that together. So 1 in 20 times 1 in 20 is 1 in 400. So you have to have a 1 in 400 chance or less that your results are not due to your intervention, that they're due to some random factor. So our first study, which we published, was 0.0001, 1 in 10,000. Our second study is similar. So it's better than 1 in 10 million that our results are random. So we're in phenomenal shape. We have similar results in terms of efficacy. The second phase 3 study differed from the first one in that the first one was severe PTSD and the second is moderate to severe. But that's the only difference.
All right, Rick, can you tell us about the social justice work that MAPS nonprofit is doing with regard to Ibogaine and the DEA, et cetera? Yes.
So, as I said, my father's hero was Saul Alinsky, and I grew up on stories of genocide and oppression and all of that. So it's essential that we do social justice work. And so the way that MAPS approaches this is that there's 2 main areas, I would say. One is working to end the racist nature of the drug war, working to end the drug war. So that's inherently working on social justice. The other is trying to have equitable access to people for MDMA-assisted therapy. For example, in terms of drug policy, one of the things that we're trying to do is work at the U.S. Sentencing Commission. So the Sentencing Commission sets sentencing guidelines for people who are caught distributing or possessing illegal drugs. So it's hard to make drugs legal or to decriminalize them, but if you can reduce the penalties at the U.S. Sentencing Commission, that's an important way to move towards reducing the prison population and all. So in 2001, I testified before the U.S. Sentencing Commission, as did Dave Nichols and others, and our testimony was completely ignored. And various experts from the government testified about how MDMA would cause brain damage. And so the penalties for MDMA were set very large. Right now, if you have an equivalent amount of cocaine or MDMA, you'll go to jail longer for MDMA. All right, so in 2015, people from the Sentencing Commission reached out to us and said, we'd like to do more hearings. The science has changed. We think the penalties on MDMA are excessive. And so we'd like to have more hearings. And we're like, great, let's have more hearings. It went along slowly. And then in 2016, Donald Trump got elected. And he appointed Jeff Sessions to be the Attorney General. And Jeff Sessions was like, there's going to be no Sentencing Commission meetings. There's going to be nothing. We don't want to make any penalties any easier on anything. And not only that, but during the period of Trump, people's appointments to the Sentencing Commission expired, and they didn't appoint anybody. They didn't even want anybody. They didn't even want the Sentencing Commission to exist. So one of the big social justice projects of ours has been to get President Biden to appoint people on the Sentencing Commission so that they can actually meet and review MDMA and penalties for other drugs as well. So a few months ago that succeeded, that Biden nominated enough people to be on the Sentencing Commission, Senate confirmed them. So that's just one aspect of the work that we do with social justice. We also try to work on drug decrim, drug legalization in different areas. In terms of our research, I would say I was very naive in the sense that I underestimated resistance in the African American community to being part of clinical research because of the injustices of the past and the Tuskegee experiment, where African Americans with syphilis were left untreated, even though treatments were available to see the course of disease. So completely unethical. But our first study in phase 2 was one of the first studies that we did was in veterans, firefighters, and police officers. And I just assumed that the military is very well integrated, that there's 40% of the people of color, that people are in groups together, they're bonded. So somehow I just assumed that when we started working with veterans, that we would have a diverse population applying to be in the study. And that didn't happen at all. We had no African Americans in the first phase 3 study, which is really bad. The FDA wants your study subjects to be representative of America. And so Natalie Ginsburg, who works on our staff, realized that what we really needed to do was train therapists of color. So we got various philanthropists to donate, and we had a training for therapists of color. For our second phase 3 study, which we started a couple years ago, we realized that we needed to ensure to do even a better job. We'd done a terrible job before, that we needed to do a good job of bringing in people of color into the study. So we do have more therapists of color, and when people of color would apply, we'd put them to the top of the waiting list. And so our second phase 3 study has more than half the people are people of color. So it was a tremendous accomplishment to build that trust, to get people to donate, to volunteer, to be in the studies, and to get a lot of people to donate for these special trainings. And so I think that's been a major accomplishment of ours, to be able to have now, when you combine the two studies, we'll have the population representative of America. The other thing, just in terms of social justice, is to think about one of the reasons we're here in Iceland is how do we help people who are in prison, who are suffering from trauma, where trauma is often not ever treated. How do we reduce recidivism? And the idea is that if we can give people in prison MDMA therapy or recently released MDMA therapy, that might help them be more grounded, work through a lot of their rage and fear, and to be more capable of finding a new way of life. So we are very much interested here. There's some interest in the Minister of Justice and his team to potentially doing something to try to reduce recidivism. The other part of the social justice is to think, what is our goal? What is our real long-term goal? And so for most of the history of MAPS, our goal was just to make MDMA into a medicine and ideally have equitable access to it. But now it looks like we've got the data. There's a very good chance we think we'll have FDA approval. And this now interacts with our challenge of where do we get the resources from? Is it from investors? Is it from donors? So our new goal is a world of net zero trauma by 2070. So we're planning way ahead. What that means, though, there's always going to be trauma. There's always going to be tragedy. There's always going to be death. That we'll never have a world of no trauma, but we want to stop adding to the trauma. And I think over the next 20, 30 years, the trauma in the world is just going to increase. There is this estimated 1 billion potential climate refugees by 2050. There's around 14 million people in prison right now around the world. There's untold numbers more on probation. And so what we want to do is think about a world of net zero trauma, and what that means is that we need to go all over the world to refugee camps, to migrants, to South Africa, to Rwanda, to places where there's just enormous amounts of trauma and not a lot of money. And so we need to explore group therapy models, working with local healers. It's something that MAPS is now trying to develop a research institute to do on some of these humanitarian projects. Another thing we're doing for social justice is it's an opportunist situation. That it turns out there's Israelis and Palestinians doing ayahuasca and MDMA together in Israel. So there's a 3-year project that we've done with Lior Roseman. I helped arrange the funding from Christian Angermeyer, the founder of Atai and the main stockholder of Compass. And so Christian has said he's not just out for money, he's also a man of peace. And so he's funded this 3 years of working with Lior Rosman to do work with these Israelis and Palestinians. The first year was interviews. The second year was to bring a group to Spain to administer MDMA and to try to see how you see the other, if those things can shift. And they're going to be probably doing that again this coming year. So what we're trying to do is a project with MDMA that would take the Israelis and Palestinians that are involved in some of the psilocybin work, the ayahuasca work, and try to bring them to Spain for an MDMA experience. So we've just hired researchers at Hebrew University that have the largest academic center in conflict management and resolution. And so they're going to help us develop metrics to see how we can evaluate whether this intervention is a success. So that's just another aspect of the social justice part of it. I think with the phase 2 study, with more than half the people in the second phase 3 study being of color, that we will have a good overall demographic for that. So I think the social justice part is an integral part of what we do.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's a global kind of reach when it comes to the work that you're doing, and and trying to partner with communities across the world to bring these medicines to where they're needed.
And one of the big parts of that, I'll just say, is going to be group therapy. That we're going to go into countries where there's not a lot of therapists, or hardly any therapists or psychiatrists, but that there's enormous amounts of trauma and hardly any money. So we're going to have to find new group therapy methods with local healers and try to train them the basics about MDMA. So I think it'll be really interesting over the next decade or so what kind of treatment models we can develop. And I predict that some of them may end up looking like raves. You know, communal dancing, where people on the fringes can go, you know, sit down and talk to a therapist or something if they have a difficult time integrating what's happening. So I'm very much looking forward to that over the next 20 years to see how do we develop new models. Like in Rwanda, we've been talking to people in Rwanda where, you know, genocide of the Tutus, and but how do you use these tools of healing and forgiveness? So I think that'll be a big part of globalizing what we're doing, because so much of the traumas in the third world is elsewhere. So to really have a world of net zero trauma, it means using the resources that we may make from the Benefit Corp for this larger mission.
So generally, Rick, my observation has been that in the psychedelic space, generally, when it comes to BIPOC communities or when it comes to LGBTQ+ communities, etc., companies hire consultants to support that work. And so what I would like to see, and I think in the conversations that I've had, is more efforts around diversity in the leadership of the company. And so my question to you is there any organizational strategy at MAPS to diversify leadership and ensure that there's representation there?
Well, there's both gender and racial, let's say. So we do have several women on the board. We had a third that recently resigned. We've added Carl Hart to the board of directors. Several people were concerned that he's so outspoken about the need for not thinking, oh, here's these good psychedelics and these other drugs are bad. You know, this psychedelic exceptionalism. So he's been very strong in arguing for saying that heroin, opiates, they should be legal as well. And I think he's right about that. So we're really proud to have Carl on the board. I think that there's got to be, you know, more over time to add even more diversity onto the board, but we do have, I'd say, a very important step still to take. Yeah, so we're not done adding to the board, but I'm worried a little bit, I'd say, about the board in the sense that groups tend to be more conservative than individuals, and MAPS has always been a risk-taking organization. So I'm worried about the board, as we get closer and closer to FDA approval and things like that, becoming more conservative. So we're kind of not so eager to add more people to the board. And I've seen people that have been very enthusiastic, but once they get on the board, they become a little bit more cautious. But I think that we've done a fair job of diversifying the board and the staff and the therapeutic community. But we've got some work to go still.
So collective liberation is the idea that all of our struggles are interconnected and that within systems of oppression, everyone suffers.
Yeah.
So how are MAPS and MAPS PBC being intentional and embodying the principles of collective liberation in the work that you're doing?
So an easy one I'll say is we'll start out when we talk about trying to reduce recidivism and to try to give support to people once they emerge from prison. But by collective liberation, the hard part for me is that includes the police and the prison guards. So it's easy to say, yeah, we want to help the prisoners, but we also, so when we talk about doing these projects in the carceral system, we also talk about what some might think are the perpetrators, the police and the prison guards, but they also are traumatized by being in that situation, and as a result, they're more mean and nasty than they are in other ways. I think my nephew is now a police officer in Washington, D.C. with the D.C. police. My sister is the only one of my siblings that I was never able to convince to smoke pot or to do MDMA, and she's kind of a harsh mom. And so I think, her son wanted to be a police officer, and so now he's a lieutenant in the Capitol Police. I think this other idea of collective liberation is really to talk about training therapists of color, to try to bring this there to those communities. We want to do work on Indian reservations. I believed as I was growing up, I just bought into it unconsciously, this idea of American exceptionalism. Now I don't see it that way. I see that we were blessed by having, instead of Europe where you have all these small countries that are at war with each other, we had all these 50 states, but in one, it's more fractured now, but as I was growing up and I felt that like the free travel and commerce between all these different people, that's where our strength came from the system, not from the people. And now it's been more marginalized and fractionalized. So another part of this, I would say, collective liberation has been that, and it's difficult to say, but it's been very important for us to have Republican support, to have bipartisan support for what we're doing, that it's really for everybody. And I think this other part of the marginalized communities, we do have quite a number of people from the queer community that are therapists that are trying to work in that context. We have this project that Natalie talks about, the Israelis and Palestinians, but she says the real hard one is going to be Democrats and Republicans. Once we solve the Middle East crisis, we'll come back to the harder case of Democrats and Republicans. And so that's a hard thing. How do we think about these Republicans that are turning into fascists in different ways or undermining democracy? How do we reach out to them? So that's not the normal way of thinking about collective liberation, because I think of them more as the oppressors, but we need to help perpetrators as well as the victims. But I think that this other point of collective liberation really for us is a big part of it, for me at least, is the drug policy reform and the drug legalization. Because how do we provide access to these tools? I mean, you could say, oh yeah, we want to get it covered by insurance, but look at all the number of people that don't even have insurance. And so I think if we can make it legally available as, for $10 that you can do it on your own, and then we can train the population in peer support and harm reduction so that there'll be more easier access for a lot of people. We want to move towards national health care if we ever get there. But I do think that this idea of net zero trauma by 2070 really means that we don't want to stick in the first world. I mean, in big pharma, you make the most money from the US, Europe, and Japan. Those are the three places where the income comes into pharma. And so we want the Benefit Corp to be focusing a lot on the heat map of the world where the trauma is, not where the money is. And I'd say that's the biggest contribution to collective liberation, is to the global burden of pain and suffering, and how do we reduce that. And I think that will depend a lot on, are we able to get the resources that we need to reach this sustainability point from donors rather than investors? You know, we have mission-aligned investors so far, but I worry about how that might continue. And so we're doing an all-out effort to try to find donors to help us make to the sustainability point.
Yeah, I love that, Rick, and I love what you said about specifically making the medicines available and training the community to do the harm reduction work. And I was talking about that earlier today on the panel that I was on, but I think generally that's, when we talk about collective liberation, it's like, how do we empower the communities to do this work for themselves and to be able to do it in a safe way?
And I'll say that I think there's the fact that the Public Benefit Corp is focused on public benefit, not profit, that almost all of the for-profit pharma companies are worried about drug policy reform as bad for the business model. You know, if you can grow your own mushrooms for free, if you can buy MDMA for $10, why are you going to buy it from the pharmaceutical company, MAPS, that could charge $1,000 or more for this drug? Well, because we want it from, the insurance companies will hopefully cover it. But my bottom line is that if the legalization is bad for the business model, we have to put legalization first. That's the fundamental human rights violation. That's the way to provide access. So I think that's really the commitment that we have, is that we need this parallel track, drug policy reform and drug development, and if the drug policy reform is bad for the business model, that doesn't matter. We've got to do it. I actually think it'll be good for the business model, because I think it will destigmatize psychedelic psychotherapy to go through the legalization. And there's such a burden of trauma. We want people to self-medicate. We want them to do peer support. But I think there'll be ever more people that say, I want to go to these trained professionals covered by insurance, and they will customize their treatment for me, and they'll start with ketamine or MDMA or psilocybin or wherever, and there'll be a unique treatment path for each individual, and that's what we want to see.
So important for you to be to say that, honestly. I love it. I think I share your vision, and I share your hopes for that kind of model moving forward. And on a public health standpoint, right, a lot of times the argument is that, well, if we decriminalize or if we put it in the community, there's all these risks, right? But the more that we allow for them to be cornered into a certain paradigm or framework, the more that these things are going to be used out of a context where we can actually reach people and support them and educate them and provide the...
I should say one of the learnings I had from my father is that my dad was a pediatrician and from Chicago, and he and his partners actually worked on the first study of crack babies. And early on, he told me that this is a bunch of propaganda. He said that what he could tell, they did the medical evaluations. They didn't do the other part, but they said that these kids, it's not from cocaine, it's from malnutrition, it's from poverty, it's not like fetal alcohol syndrome. And what he saw was that the women that were pregnant, that were using crack, that the laws kept them away from seeking treatment because they were worried that they would be prosecuted or their babies would be taken away from them. And so he developed this concept to me that was that the more dangerous the drug, the more important it is that it be legal, because you don't want to push people away from treatment. So I've seen the drug war supposedly solving problems actually creates way more problems than it solves. And in particular, it stigmatizes people and it drives people that need help away from treatment. And then it's sold in a racist and propagandist way to support the private prisons and all of that. So I think that the drug war is such a big producer of harm and violence that that ending that has to take priority over whatever the business model is.
Well, okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
We did it in Iceland of all places.